Here we are for another round of the 70s versus the 90s, and it's a close encounter of the surly kind with Ridley Scott's Alien versus Roger Donaldson's Species. And so let's just dive right on into it. First off, we've got Alien, directed by Ridley Scott, written by Dan O'Bannon, and the designs of the alien done by H.R. Geiger, who also did the creature designs for Species. Now, Alien kind of has that same issue that Jaws had before it, where they couldn't get the alien to work on camera, so they had to go with the technique of not showing the alien, which, as Jaws proved, is a fantastic technique and can make your movie way more terrifying than if you just show the alien or whatever creature that you're doing, because what we don't see is far more intriguing than what we do see, because what the mind can fuck us with is unimaginable, and limitless. And with one thing about Ridley Scott, he's a definitely a detail oriented filmmaker, and the set designs and just production design in general is just on point. The designs by H.R. Geiger and the technicians that brought it to life did it perfectly. Like, it really just puts you in that world, and those long stretches of just seeing that stuff, that chamber room where the guy in the chair is, that Ridley Scott felt so compelled to make a whole movie about, with Prometheus, which sucked. But Alien doesn't suck at all. It's kind of a slow start at first, but that's kind of get you introduced to everything, the spaceship and stuff. It's a group of a commercial craft that, it's just a bunch of working class people. They're hauling like mineral ore back to Earth, and the crew of this is an exceptional cast. I mean, you've got Tom Skerritt, Yaphet Kotto, Harry Dean Stanton, Ian Holm, John Hurt, and of course Sigourney Weaver, who's a total badass. This is the movie that really like catapulted her into like badass status. Something that would be cemented with the sequel to this, Aliens. But the crew, and usually with Ridley Scott, he kind of focuses more on like attention to detail than he does his actors. Not really the case with this film. It's still very early in his career. It's only like his second or third movie at this point in time, and he completely crushes it. Like, he really crafts a brilliant thriller. Because we've got this unstoppable killing machine. The thing bleeds acid. And for me, I always thought like the xenomorphs were kind of lame. But, when you can do a thriller like this, plus it's very claustrophobic, tight spaces, and you got a bunch of sarcastic people. And then there's the twist, Ian Holm's a fucking android, which is a really, really good twist in the story. And, and then the lack of fucking like, this thing's killing them off, but we still got to keep it because the company wants it type shit, And that final scene, when they finally, the thing explodes and then, Sigourney Weaver gets away on that fucking pod, and then, oh shit, the aliens there in the fucking thing with her. It didn't kill the aliens. So then she blasted out. Probably, out of all the horror films that you see this trope of the final girl, so to speak, this is the only one that was like just badass. She's in control. She's not, hiding in closet. She hides in that closet to get in that fucking spacesuit to blast that fucker into space and shit. So I mean. And the cool thing about an Alien is it doesn't rely heavily on an iconic score to be chilling. The movie's kind of chilling on its own. It's dark, dreary, and then just mechanical when it's just all white and everything. So Ridley Scott kind of crafts his own fear. Not to say the music in Alien, the score by Jerry Goldsmith isn't good, but it's not as like memorable as say Jaws. And I don't think it evokes the same fear that the score for Jaws does, and even for that matter, the score for Halloween, the kind of fear that it exudes. Really, it's just that unknown fucking xenomorph lurking around that's very terrifying. And of course, even the when you finally see the alien at the end, even if it doesn't look as perfect as it should, if Alien Covenant taught us anything, the less we see of these fucking xenomorphs, the better. You really want to like dive deep into that, go look at a book of H.R. Geiger's drawings and shit, but seeing it on film, it don't, about the furthest you could push it is, James Cameron and Aliens, and, even recently with Alien Romulus. But Ridley Scott proved it right out of the gate. He just didn't he just thought that technology can make them motherfuckers look better, and no, they cannot. And it is more chilling when the shit's lurking behind the shadows and stuff. But there's only so many times you can do that, you know. And it's kind of like Jaws. Once you've made the perfect movie, it's kind of hard to make a sequel. The only bitch of it was, though, James Cameron did make a better sequel than than the original movie. Aliens, I would argue, probably the best in the franchise, but Alien itself is, you know, if not perfect, pretty near to perfect as far as it hits all the notes that a thriller should. And you know, and just the way the cast interacts with each other, you really feel like you believe these people as the characters, you know. And I also feel like Kristen Stewart kind of stole Sigourney Weaver's style when she did Love Lies Bleeding, especially that end scene when she blasts right before she gets into the spacesuit, before she blasts the alien out of the shuttle. But then you got Species, you know, which is it immediately where like Alien kind of starts out a little slow. This one just kind of jumps right into it, you know. It moves like a bullet, you know, and you know, for the first like 2/3 of the movie, it's fucking going, you know, because you know what it is. Whereas like an Alien, they pick up, you know, this distress signal, and then they end up, you know, getting this alien on board because it attaches itself to John Hurt. Another great moment when that thing shoots out of him, you know, that's one of the most iconic sequences ever committed to celluloid. But in Species, they get a DNA sample from like some fucking thing they've been broadcasting to, and it sends them a thing. So they decide to create their own alien fucking thing, and it's like an ultimate predator and shit. You know, they make it female to be more docile and controllable. You know, so much for being smart. But the thing of it is, though, now she's escaped after they try to kill it. And then, you know, Natasha Henstridge in her first role, who is smoking hot. But, you know, the movie just uses too much of that TNA. You know, at times, the only thing that differentiates it from, like, one of those Skinamax flicks that would come on late night is its cast, which is just as exceptional, I would argue, as Alien. Because, you know, you get, you know, the great Michael Madsen, you know, Mark Helgenberger, Forrest Whitaker, Ben Kingsley, Alfred Molina. You know, and everybody's crushing their part. And, you know, the film, it's fun, you know, and it is sexy, but, you know, it just kind of relies more on the trashiness than it does the actual thrills. There are some, like, genuinely thrilling moments in it, but once they get to the point where the fucking Alfred Molina ends up impregnating the fucking thing, and, you know, they're going to hunt it just becomes lame as fuck. And then when it ends, you know, the shit with the rat, you know, they leave it wide open for a sequel. And much like Alien, they made a few sequels to this one. Species 2 is really the only one of note. You know, they made a whole bunch of other ones after that. But Species 2 actually retains the original cast that survived from the first one and, you know, moves that forward. But then after that, none of the original people came back. So it's, you know, like Lake Placid, you know, all these other ones are straight to video sequels and shit. But the Species itself, you know, like I said, it just doesn't, it's not as like intense or as iconic as Alien. You know, it doesn't have that fucking oomph, you know, because also even if we're going off of H.R. Geiger's designs for the creature, you know, it's really like Species is kind of more the kind of shit that he liked to draw, you know, real like fucking industrial tits and ass kind of thing. Whereas like Alien was kind of a unique fucking thing, you know, that even just the whole design and stuff, you don't really get that very much in Species. And you can clearly, even with some of the computer generated effects of the time, you can kind of tell how fake that shit looks. You know, granted they were still perfecting it at the time, but when you see somebody do shit like real, like they did in Alien, you know, even if it is, you know, guy in a suit or whatever the fuck, who knows, it looks better, less is more type shit. And, you know, a bit of excessive in Species and stuff, even delivering like on the gore scale. Nothing wrong with a lot of gore, but, you know, it has to be organic to the story, so to speak, you know, really just no more than just a TNA slasher flick with an alien in it, you know. So I got to give this round to Alien. You know, it's a motherfucking classic. You know, it really can't be beat unless we're talking about Aliens. But as far as like an opener to a franchise, you know, you can't really like, you know, fuck with it, you know. And, you know, not even being that big of a Ridley Scott fan, you know, it's still like he showed with that film, like he knows what the fuck he's doing as a filmmaker. Arguably just as good by volume as Steven Spielberg. You know, they both kind of have the same trajectory, only Ridley Scott's just a little more cynical than Spielberg. So if anybody's keeping score on that, that's 18, 19. 90s are still up by 1, but, you know, like I said, the 70s, you know, it was a very great, iconic, great decade. You know, they'll keep coming back, you know, as hard as the 90s have been coming, you know, so it's definitely getting exciting, straight up sizzling. You know, like I said, if I've said anything wrong or anything you disagree with, feel free to eviscerate me in the comments. I don't give a fuck. You know, like I said, this is all fun and games for me. Like, nobody asked for this, and, you know, nobody really needs this except me, because I got to know who the fuck was better, the 70s or the 90s. And right now, the 90s are up by 1, so who knows? We got the main event coming up next Saturday, The Godfather versus Goodfellas. You know, more of these bonus rounds like this will continue to pop up because, like I said, I have no life and I got to know.